All right, hello again. So in this video, I'm going to demonstrate how to create responsive web pages using media queries. Effectively, this is going to be what will let you be able to make it so that your web page can work really effectively on mobile devices like cell phones or iPhones or whatever, tablets and stuff. Um, yeah. So I want to note before we begin that again that this video is intended to supplement the course reading. So the text under responsive CSS, which is what we're talking about, has a lot more details about what we mean by responsive design, and what you would want to do with that kind of work and some tricks that you would potentially use. I'm going to try to focus on some of the mechanics and going over those main pieces so you can see them in action, but make sure you actually read the course text because that's going to have a lot more information than just what I go over in this video. All right, so let's go ahead and let's begin. So one of our big sort of to-dos when trying to design a web page, right? One of our big sort of goals whenever we're making any kind of web page or web application is we want to be able to make them accessible. We want to make them sure that they can be used by people with different kinds of devices like screen readers and so forth. But at the same time, we're also interested in, of course, supporting people who are using the wide variety of site-based devices out there. So they could be using desktops, mobile phones, tablets, watches, whatever kinds of ways that the people are trying to access the internet. And we need to make sure that our page is going to work effectively on all of them. So we do this by using what we call responsive design. And the basic idea of responsive design is we want to have the same set of content on our page, but we want its appearance, its visual appearance, to be different depending on what kind of device is used to view that page. So if you look at this sort of example that I've yanked off the internet somewhere, on the sort of a full desktop, it's got this multi-column layout, one column for each browser, with lots of details, and they've got like numbers at the top, and there's lots of content going on there. When it moves down to a smaller laptop, you'll notice that it has some of the content disappears, right? Some of the icons change around because we're not loading in icons because we now don't want to necessarily use much bandwidth. Some of the numbers disappear. There's some some other piece sort of begins like it actually begins constraining to a different kinds of size. When we move on to something smaller like a tablet, then we actually lose our side-by-side columns because there's not enough space for them anymore, and instead go to sort of just a single column with elements sort of on top with sort of as you can sort of scroll through them. And then, of course, when you move to really small devices, there's clearly no room to even show multiple ones of these elements at the same page on the same time. So instead, you'll make it so that you, in fact, would sort of view them one after another. Maybe you're clicking through them. Maybe you're scrolling through them in different kinds of ways. But the idea is that we can change the organization and the structure and appearance of our content based on, in order to support whatever kind of design, whatever kind of device we happen to be looking at or we're interested in doing. And we're going to develop, and because the content stays the same, our HTML is going to stay the same, we're just going to modify some CSS to say, use different appearances, different stylings on different kinds of devices. The other thing that I'm going to note before we sort of dive into the code that drives this is that we're really interested in doing a sort of a mobile-first approach. What that means that we're going to be interested in saying, let's design our web app so that it works well and looks good on mobile devices. That's going to be our primary target. This is weird because I know everyone is like generally doing development on a desktop or on a laptop, but we're going to really be focusing in on, so what does it look like as sort of your main target to be on mobile devices? That's because most people, the greatest majority of people access the web on mobile phones. So we want to make sure that that's sort of the primary, the goal, that we want to make sure everything looks really, really well for those people. And then as we gain more space, right? As we go to bigger devices and we gain more capabilities, we get more screen, in particular in terms of more screen space, we can then start trying to effectively add extra visual display. We can say, oh, look, now we have room to show more images. Now we have room to show our content side by side. Now we have room to show a bigger banner at the top. So that you can think is as we gain more space, we start being able to add more functionality to our page. We're doing what we call a progressive enhancement approach, where we're going to start making sure everything works perfectly on a small device, and then as we get bigger, we say, hey, we got more resources, let's use those more resources. This is opposed to thinking, let's try to design our website so it looks great on a mobile device, and then as we get smaller, let's make sure it doesn't break along the way. What's known as graceful degradation. The canonical example of graceful degradation is an escalator, where an escalator is this amazing piece of technology, right? It's like moving steps, and if the thing breaks down, if something goes wrong, it turns into stairs and it still works, right? We don't want your web page to break because someone has moved it onto a mobile device. But we don't want to be thinking about, oh, we're losing capabilities, everything's falling apart. We want to be thinking about, oh, we're gaining capabilities as we get bigger. Let's add more stuff. It's a very positive kind of approach, and it's going to drive how we both design our code and how we're able to sort of, and basically how we sort of start organizing a lot of our CSS in order to make this kind of thing work. All right, great. So with that in mind, let's go ahead. I'm going to minimize this for a second. Let's go ahead and start talking about how we can actually do this work. And the way that we're going to do this is using what are called media queries. So a media query is basically going to be a way to include something like an if statement in your CSS. So we're basically going to be able to write some CSS statements that says effectively, if this page is on a desktop, if it's big, use these rules. Otherwise, don't. So let's see how this works. So the starter code we're going to play around with is I'm going to play around with the code that's basically a variation, a slight tweak to some of the stuff we did with the Flexbox demo previously. Mostly because this way we have puppies to look at. We have sort of a bit of content that's kind of meaningful, and puppies, right? Puppies. So what we have is, again, I've got sort of a div that's like my Flexbox pool. It's got all my sort of these list of cards inside of them, and each card has then got some Flexbox stuff and organized in order to produce this kind of effect that we want. So that's what's looking great. So you might think like, hey, if we shrink our browser down like this to sort of mobile phone width, that actually looks pretty good, right? So we sort of designed the page to look okay on mobile devices. As we get to sort of the big desktop display, you're like, well, that doesn't maybe look as good. Now we've got this ton of white space. It seems like maybe we want to do some work on there, and we'll talk about how we can do that in a second. So I will notice that, like, yeah, resizing the browser seems like it might be a way of testing whether something looks good on mobile, but the Chrome Developer Tools actually offers a better structure for letting us do this work. So we say, okay, great, here's what it looks like on a desktop. If I go to the Developer Tools, then if you notice, so we talked about this button we can use to select different elements on the page. If you look next to it, there's a button there that looks a little bit like a cell phone and the tablet. It looks a little bit like, right, like this picture, effectively. That's what you can sort of imagine it showing. And it's called the device toolbar. What this is going to do is if you click this, it's basically going to create a fake, it's going to turn your browser into a fake version of a mobile device so that you can then be able to test what this would look like if it was rendered on a mobile phone. So when we do this, you'll see what happens is that it basically creates a mobile phone version of my application of my page and shows me what it would look like on that mobile phone. From this, you can specify some sizing here. So you can say, like, I want to see what it looks like on a screen that has a 400 pixel width by 680 pixel height, right? So there's like for example, a particular size of a phone. It has a couple predefined constants. So if you want to know what it looks like on an iPhone X, it sort of says like, great, here's the ratio for iPhone X stuff. These pixel sizes don't match to Retina sizes. So I know like you might say a lot of mobile phones will say, oh, it's got 1080p resolution. That's all like Retina level stuff. This is actually measuring more like a DPI level work as opposed to, sorry, not DPI. It's measuring more of sort of what's called density independent pixels. So in general, 450 pixels is like sort of your small cell phone. They maybe get up to 500, 600. That's sort of about the size. In any case, we can see what this looks like here. And the thing that we want to notice, we just go to responsive, we can specify the size ourselves, is that if we stretch it out so that it looks like our normal page, right? This is what it looked like on desktop. You'll notice that as I shrink it down, what happens is that my content goes tiny, right? It doesn't actually do what it was doing under the browser, right? When I turn off this device thing, what happened is that as I shrunk down, eventually it just sort of stopped, right, at 500 pixels here. But when I have my device toolbar turned on, we can see that what happens is that as I get down to like the 400, 300 pixel range, which is the size of not the highest end iPhone, but for like normal phones that people who are not super rich use, the people that we actually really want to try to support, like consumer, the $50 Android device phones. So this is going to basically, you can see that what's happening is that everything is sort of shrinking down. The reason it's doing this is because the browser by default will say, hey, like, I don't have enough space to actually render this content. I'm going to zoom out the page so that you can still see all that content there, because as the screen gets really small, the browser's solution is to zoom out so you can see everything rather than trying to have everything scroll off the side of the page. If you visited so there's some websites you might visit where if you're using on your phone, something like everything zooms out really tiny as opposed to like looking nice, and you have to then pinch a bunch to zoom to get back to size. Or if you've ever looked at the desktop version of a site, requested the desktop version of a site on your mobile phone, it's doing this kind of work. So what we're going to want to do, in order to make our page responsive, is we want to make sure that when we get down to small sizes, that the browser isn't going to take over and start shrinking everything. So what we're going to do is we're going to basically add some HTML to our code to say, hey, browser, don't shrink. I'll handle it. I'll do all the resizing work. You don't need to do any zooming thing. Let me do the work myself. So what we're going to do is we're going to go into our meta section, our head section, and we're going to add another meta tag. The meta tag we're going to add is what's called a viewport meta. So this is listed in the, I can never remember exactly what the content is, so I'm going to go yank it out of the course text, which is usually the best place for you to get to. So if you go to specifying viewport in your course text, there's this meta tag that has a name viewport, and it has a bunch of configuration specifications that's telling the browser effectively to don't shrink the device when it gets small, just leave it normal, and we'll let the CSS that's defined handle how that happens. So I'm going to copy that, and then I'll go yank that back, go drop that into my, sorry, wrong button. I'm going to drop that into my HTML. So I now have this viewport meta sitting there in my head. If I then go back to my page, if I then refresh it, you'll notice that what happens is that now it's not shrinking by itself, right? So now that when my device is bigger, it has the white space, but as my device gets down to cell phone size, it doesn't shrink the content until we get really, really, really small, right? But the sort of at that range between, say, 400 to 600 pixels, where we really care about things, our size is staying the same. This is going to let all of our actual responsive code actually work. So you want to make sure you've included that viewport meta in order to actually make your page responsive. All right, great. So we've got our responsive page. So we can see that this is gonna, and this is gonna look a little bit silly maybe because I'm trying to make sure I can show both the code and the page at the same time. So we have sort of our responsive page, and we might say like, well, so we want to figure out how we can make it change across different devices. So the way that we're gonna do that is we're gonna use what are called media queries. So we have a bunch of CSS rules in my in my style.css file. We can then add ourselves in a media query, which is similar to a CSS rule. What this media query looks like is we're going to use a special tag or a special keyword called @media, which indicates that we're writing a media query. This is going to be a lot like, you can really think of this as like an if statement. It's almost like we've written the word if. But we're going to say if the media, if the browser that we're on has some characteristics, do some work. So the way that we write a media query is then we're going to put inside parentheses, we're going to put what are the requirements, right? What are the conditions under which we want to apply some rules? So the most common, the condition that we're generally going to be using in this class is what's called the min-width condition, which is basically saying that if the width is at least this minimum, if it's this size or greater, so you can think of this as saying if width is greater than or equal to, I think it's a strict equality. It doesn't really matter. But so we say if the width is this size, then we can do some work. So as an example, let's see, this browser right here. So this is at 11,000 pixels. So I'm going to use what looks like an arbitrary number, but it's not. I'll go over it next video a little bit why we use this number. But I'm going to basically talk about 768 as what I call a breakpoint. So we're going to say that when we get to 768 pixels wide, we're going to start doing some other stuff. And we're then going to put a block, a CSS block. So this is effectively saying that if the width is greater than 768 pixels, do some work. Great. So there's lots of other media queries that exist out there. In practice, width is going to be used as a proxy for everything else about screen size. Because rather than trying to actually detect like if the browser type is mobile or if something else going on, we're really going to say, okay, maybe that stuff might not be getting reported consistently. Width is reported consistently. We're going to go with that one pretty much the whole way through. All right, so inside this if statement, we're then going to write down what are all the rules that we want to apply to our page. So as a really obvious, I'm going to start with really obvious examples just so we can sort of see this in action. And I'm going to specify that I want my body's background color to change. So we'll basically start by saying that if we get to 768, let's go ahead and make this maybe, is there like a light blue? How about a light blue? Because I think it's not going to be too eye-searing. So what it's saying is that if my width becomes 768 pixels, then I want my page's background to be light blue. You'll notice again, this is a rule, right? I'm saying what's my selector and what's my properties I'm applying to, and I want to do that work, right? Run that selector and apply that code of paint if this media query is true. All right, so we'll go ahead and we'll write that. And you'll notice that now that we are in a really big page, right? Where now we're not really big, but we're bigger than 768 pixels. My background color is blue. If I shrink my page down so it's smaller than that, it's only 600 pixels wide, my color stays white, right? That rule doesn't apply. If I raise the styling here, let's see. So you can see that at this size, the rule background color light blue is getting applied to my page. And then if I get smaller, that rule then disappears and is no longer being applied to my page as well. I do want to note that the reason that so I'm writing the media query down here sort of at the bottom of my page. And the reason that we're doing that is because these want to be rules specify alterations that we want to make to the content. So if, for example, if our page by default, right, this is going to be, so these are the defaults, right? Our page normally might have a body that might have a background color of, how about, I'm going to go with a really, really subtle gray. No, how about like EEE? That's a real light gray. So we might say that our page normally, right, in small devices, and by normal, for us, normal means mobile, right, has a sort of this slight gray background going on. But then as we get bigger, right, so you see there's my rule, my body background color is EEE. But then as we get bigger, what happens is this other rule, we're reading through the CSS page, the thing at the bottom has the exact same specificity, it's the same selector. So this rule applies last, right, because it's the last one on the page, so it wins, so it ends up overriding the previous rule at the top. If I had put this media query at the very top of my page, before my default background body, then what would happen is that at refresh the page, right, at small devices, the media query doesn't apply, but then when we get to bigger media query size, the media query is getting applied there, but you'll notice it's getting overridden by the thing that's further down on the page. So the structure you'll want to use is you're going to want to put your media queries below your default styling options in terms of sort of where these go on the page. All right, so inside this media query, we can actually include lots and lots and lots of rules. So for example, I might say I've styled the body to have a background color of light blue. But I might say, oh, you know what? But it kind of looks weird where the card has that light blue background in it. So maybe I say I also want my card to have a background color of white. Right? So again, we're writing this effectively saying that here's the set of rules we want to apply in this media query. If this statement is true, do all these rules at once. It's legal, it's valid code for you to write multiple media queries, for me to put at media min width 768 one rule, at media min width 768 one rule. That's valid, but it's much better practice and styling to really say, here's all the things I want to do when my page gets big. Let's write a whole bunch of stuff together all at once. And so that we can get that kind of work. Right, so we can do all kinds of things here. We can basically change anything you'd be able to do with CSS. So I'm using color as an example because I think it's pretty clear to see how it happens, right? It's really very obvious. But we can do lots of other stuff instead. The common kind of other thing that you might do is we might make content appear or disappear. We might change what stuff we're actually displaying. We might change some layout. I'll go over an example of that sort of at the end. But one of the things we might say do is, like, for example, we have this paragraph here at the top talking about where these images were found from a Google search. We maybe say, like, okay, well, on a mobile device, it makes sense to have that at the top because we want to make sure that people are noticing. But if we get to a desktop, maybe we're okay with it being near the bottom because we're going to have more sort of vertical, horizontal, and we're assuming we're going to have more sort of horizontal, vertical space as well. So what we might do, for example, is I could say that we can use our flexbox power, and we might say that I want to have this images P, right? This is my normal thing. We could say that we want to take my images P, and I could say, for example, use the order property from my flexbox to say, let's put its order at like 1,000, make it last. So then what happens then on large devices, it moves to the bottom, while on small devices, it stays near the top. Yeah, not bad. Other things you might do, for example, maybe you want to have like certain images, like banner images, appear on larger devices. So maybe on our very small devices, I actually want to say that all images I actually don't want to not exist, right? We don't want to show any images on mobile devices because that would require downloading a bunch of image content. That's going to ease up your phone's bandwidth and in your data plan. We don't want to do that kind of work. So we might say, great, on a mobile device, don't show any images, right? Only show the text, effectively, placeholder stuff. I would not recommend this for an actual design. I'm trying to, again, just demonstrate how these things might work. So we might say, great, don't show that image on mobile devices, but then when we get to large actual devices, we might say that we want our image tags to once again have a display of inline, which is the default for images, which then means that once we get bigger, all my images appear again. Yay, they're all back. So what you sometimes are going to do is you're going to apply some rules that would basically say, like, don't show content, make the content really small or make it really big, right? Don't basically specify what it looks like on mobile, which might involve having some content that's not actually displayed yet, because you can then make it appear by adjusting its display property when your page gets bigger and you want things to begin showing up. Okay, I'm going to get rid of that for now because I think that's, again, that's sort of a silly example, but I'll leave it commented out so we can see how that works. Okay, great. So that's an example of a media query. That's the most basic idea. We can also add more media queries if we want. So this is one media query. This says what to do if my width is greater than 7068 pixels. I can add a second media query using @media and maybe say, here's what happens if my min width is greater than 992 pixels. And again, these are sort of arbitrary numbers. These are arbitrary numbers that are standardized arbitrary numbers. Cool. So we might say, okay, when my min width gets to 992 pixels, we want my color to change again. So maybe now my body's background color should become, how about, is there like a yellow maybe? What's a good color to use? How about a light? I want something light. Light goldenrod yellow. That looks great. I want something I'm not ice hearing. Cool. All right. So now we're basically saying that the way that our CSS gets read is it's going to apply by default the gray background, but then if our width is bigger than 768, we're going to make it light blue. So great. We'll start that. We'll start small. We refresh the page. So by default, it's light gray. This rule doesn't apply. This media query doesn't apply, so we don't do any of that. Then as we get bigger, we turn light blue because now this statement is true, so our background color light blue shows up, and our card's background color becomes white. And then as we get above 992, our color becomes yellow because now this back media query is also getting applied. You'll notice that things like my images, my text still continues to be at the bottom, my images, my card backgrounds continues to be white, because this is saying if the width is bigger than 7068 and at 1,000 pixels, this statement is still true. We're not writing mutually exclusive if statements. We're writing if statements that are all going to stack on top of each other. You don't need to boundary this thing. I don't need to say if min width is greater than 768 and less than 992. What we really want to think about doing is saying that when I get bigger, make this set of changes, and then when I get bigger than that, start overriding it to be able to provide different kinds of structure. The way this works is if you imagine in Java, you can say, for example, if x is greater than 3, I might do something like print out x. I might say print x is bigger than 3. And then you could follow that by, you have sort of two options. You could say something like if x is then, else if x is greater than 6, then I might print out that x is greater than 6. This is all pseudocode to write something that work. So the idea being here is that this would say that I'm either going to do one of these things. This rule actually would never actually apply, right? Because say if we're greater than 3, we'll do this. There's no chance of this else statement ever happening, so we never would actually print out that x is also bigger than 6. What we're going to do with media queries is we're really going to be thinking about them in terms of this sequence of if statements, which really can all be thought of independently. We're going to say, great, do this thing, done. Do this thing, done. In media queries, there is no else. There's only if. So it's not the difference between if x is greater than 3, if x is greater than 3. Right? You don't sort of keep adding these things together. You're going to basically use just having one sort of if gets sort of applied one after the other. They're not mutually exclusive. There's no else's involved. All right. Great. So that's the basic idea for how we can make get media queries. So the idea is, again, we can just, this is really all there is to making something responsive. So we say, great, let's design it so it looks good on mobile. And then as we get bigger, we can start saying, okay, now we're on to tablets. I can start making a couple more changes. Then when I get to really big devices, I can start making even more changes. And you can go from there. The standard breakpoints that you might care about. So 768 is sort of the medium size. That's like when you move to tablet. 586 maybe is the is sort of the mobile device minimum size. But this is basically anything smaller. And this is sort of considered moving to tablet. This is considered moving to desktop. If you want to move to really big displays, the breakpoint is at min width of 1200 pixels is sort of the next major breakpoint. Though this sometimes gets written as at 1400 pixels for really big displays, and it sort of varies at this point. But these are sort of standardized numbers that we tend to use, and we'll go over why. Spoiler: they come from Bootstrap, and everyone uses Bootstrap, so those are just the numbers we go with. But those are sort of your breakpoints you really end up caring about. Great, and again, the important thing to remember is that inside, and this is a really common bug, is that inside the media query, we're actually putting an entire rule, right? The selector and the property. You can't just put background color light blue inside your media query. And you can't say, oh, when I'm 768, the background color should be light blue, because CSS is not going to know what background color should be light blue. The body, the card, the page, the dog's eye, it has no idea what that is. So you don't just put the property, you need to put the entire rule, selector and property. And all the same rules and selectors apply. Effectively what's happening is they're saying if we're at a certain size, then we're going to also run these selectors in this order, right, top to bottom, at the end of the other thing, so they're going to be overriding and replacing what we've already seen. All right, cool. So I've tried giving you a couple examples of what I think are sort of practical examples. For example, we could talk about like moving things to the top and the bottom. In terms of giving an example of what sort of the way that you might really think about doing this is we might say, okay, great, on a mobile device, it's got this nice column because that makes sense. But then as we get to a really big device, we suddenly realize that, hey, I actually have enough room to put like 2 columns of things here. So they might say, it's like, okay, well, how can we adjust that? Well, if we look at what we're doing here, the part of the reason that we managed to get 1 column is that we've taken our flex pool here, and I've given it a flex direction of columns, so that basically it's saying take all these cards, and instead of lining them across, we're going to line them up and down. So what we might do is we can say, all right, well, when we get bigger, let's change that. Let's go ahead and we're going to say, let's take my flex pool, and we're going to make it so instead of having its flex direction be column, we're going to change it back to row, which is our standard, which is our normal default. And then, of course, because we're then making a row, we want to make sure that we're going to make sure that everything wraps, so that our 4 cards are not going to sort of spread across the page. They'll be able to sort of wrap around and be able to sort of fill out the whole area. So once we do that, let's go small, refresh the page. So I start small. When I get bigger, suddenly my page is no longer displaying it as a column, but is now displaying it as 4 cards in this nice side-by-side area. You'll notice that I start and then again, this currently does it so that as I get bigger, we might say, oh, look, and when I get to the sort of the 992, the larger display desktop, it's now, again, wrapping them around, so we're getting the kind of effect we want. There is some issues, of course, here you can see they're showing up where I'm now getting a bunch of sort of this white space, and I might like these things to continue to be centered. There's some other work we could do with trying to actually do that and make those things centered. We'd have to adjust our tweaking a little bit. Namely, I'd have to specify that I want my images to basically I have to do some, make a box that basically sets my margins to work the way we expect. Bootstrap will solve some of this for us a little bit, but that's sort of the basic idea is we can start looking at how we might want to do that kind of work. So we might say, okay, great, when we get here, you know what, I don't really want this to be 3 in a row. What I really might say is well, at this point, maybe my cards can just get bigger, right? Maybe they can be something else. So maybe at this point, we might say, okay, when we get to 992, maybe I want to say that I want my flex pool, let's see, what do we have for our cards? The ones that select the cards themselves are the flex pool divs, right? Those are the items inside the flex pool. So we might say that maybe when we get to flex pool, we might say we want our flex pool divs, right? The things floating inside of my sort of flex box that I've sort of made now wrap. Maybe we want to say, let's give each of those a flex basis of 50%, so we'll have them all take up half the space. So then what happens, we say, okay, great, when we get here, we've got these 2 elements, and then when we get bigger, we've got 2 more elements. You know what we actually might be able to do? I think we might even be able to, if we just do a justify content space around. Oh, never mind. That one actually fixed that problem. Well, no, wait, it might on the smaller though. See, now we got this nice spaced like bordering thing. But now we say, oh great, now we need these things to get bigger. But I need to have those not be bigger. I need the cards to do that. I thought I figured this out. Maybe I don't want the divs. Maybe I want the cards. No, that didn't do the job. Well, it made it. Yeah, normally they're 100%. Okay, so we can start trying to do some. You know what we'll do? What we could really just say is we might say that we want our cards to now be like, 600 pixels. Something like that. Like we can start trying to just, we can start hard coding in some values. Don't do this, they'll start falling apart. And then you can make it so your cards effectively expand as your content gets larger. Right, so I think I have my images, like my images have a width of 600 pixels here, so really what I could do is I could say that when I get really big, maybe my images are going to have their width go up to 600, so that my images get bigger as I get to larger displays. And again, this is now, I'm taking what was already in sort of an absolute value, the width of my images, I'm saying let's make that width bigger at larger displays. So on large devices, I'm going to get this nice 600 pixel width images. When we move to smaller displays like tablets, we move to smaller cards in a grid. And then when we move to mobile devices, we're going to move to those same smaller cards, but they're now in a single column. And again, this is now changing different sizes. And of course, if my browser gets really big, my 600 width cards now show up in the browser in my column. So I'm getting this nice like shift between grids and columns in a fairly flexible way without having to write a whole lot of rules, right? All I did was I just tweaked my flexbox direction and my image width, and I'm able to get a pretty drastic kinds of resizing effects, which will basically be able to make the same content appear differently on mobile devices in effective ways. Yeah. And that's the basic idea of how what we're going to do to make things responsive, is that we're going to say, okay, we're going to design it first to say what should it look like on mobile, and that's all the rules you're going to write, just like every other CSS rule you've ever created. Right? Just the idea is instead of trying to say, well, what's it going to look like on my computer, try to actually like open up your developer tools, go into device mode and say, what's it going to look like on a small phone, on a small display, and design it and do your design work in that way. And then you can think, all right, well, what happens now when I get to sort of a medium size, or sort of to this-ish kind of area, somewhere in here or here, sort of some of this size. And then you can say, well, what has to change? You don't want to have to rewrite all your rules, because a lot of it's going to say the same thing, right? You're still going to have cards, you're still going to have like borders and padding, a lot of it's going to stay the same, but some of it might be able to adjust. And then you can start writing in the rules to override your other options and start adding in more pieces to get your device to be able to now design your display so that it's going to take advantage of all that extra white space that's been provided for you. Finally, then you can do the same thing as things get really big, and that will then make it so that your application can be able to support lots of different device sizes as things begin to adjust. And that's the basic idea of how we make things responsive. A lot of the other then work becomes of deciding what you want to make responsive and how you want it to happen. In practice, there's not a ton of stuff you really have to make responsive. For your projects, we're really driving that, yes, you need to use some media queries because we want to make sure you understand how these work and are able to use them, so you need to do something significant with them. But in practice, you'll see that a lot of times it's going to be things like changing font sizes, changing some padding, moving some flex boxes around, and you just do that sort of enough places and you'll be able to get the kinds of effects that you want. The more extreme your layout changes, right? If you move from having like a column to having like a multi-column layout, or if you move from having a sidebar to having like a bottom panel, there's a lot of stuff that can change as you sort of as your page gets bigger. So that's the basic idea. That'll be using media queries to be able to design customized display kind of information, make things appear, disappear, move, resize, etc. In the next video, we'll talk about using a set of basically we'll talk about using Bootstrap, which is basically a way it's going to provide a bunch of responsive media query-ish like code for you to use, so you don't necessarily need to write it all yourself. But again, you need to know sort of how this media query stuff works in order to be able to do this kind of work. Great, and as always, of course, if there's any questions, please let me know. And otherwise, happy responsive designing work.